Before we start this video, it's important to point out that game design analysis is not a review show, and as such, it is an aside to help you decide if you want to buy NieR Automata or not. It's a series in which I attempt to take apart games and analyze every single aspect in detail that stands out to me, in order to figure out what the game does right, what it does wrong, what you can learn from it. And as you can probably guess from the length of this video, there's quite a bit to learn from NieR Automata. And as such, this video will contain really heavy spoilers, and if you have not played NieR Automata yet, I heavily recommend you do. It's a fantastic experience, and I sincerely believe it's one of the best the industry has to offer. If you have not played it and are unable or not interested to, but are curious as to why it is so good, I recommend watching this video by Valkyrie Aurora first before watching this one, as it sums up the story quite well, and I will not be talking about the story in order, but rather important points where it introduces interesting aspects of the writing. Lastly, it is also important to point out that the version that I analyze in this video is the Japanese version of the game. From what I've seen, this does change a couple of things, like the voice actors, in my opinion, matter a lot, and there's one or two details that I mentioned in this video, like one or two lines that I mentioned in this video, that from what I've seen, are not present in the English version. I've not played the English version yet, so I don't know the full spectrum, but I know there are differences, and I don't know where I'm gonna miss them. Without further ado, my name is Vicer. Welcome to Game Design Analysis. By the end of this video, I hope you understand how NieR Automata is a masterclass in storytelling in the game format, for its seamless and perfect connection between gameplay and storytelling. This bond is so perfect that the original draft for this video had gameplay and story in two different sections, and then I quickly realized that they go so hand in hand, it's pretty much impossible to talk about them separately. The first level is a bit different from the rest, and you'll see why eventually, so I will talk about it separately. There's a lot of things that the intro level establishes that the game later on basically completely ignores. The intro plays with perspectives a lot, while following levels don't even touch it. This level is designed for clear, straight progression with small secrets off to the side. And also the boss and the level structure is a lot more like a traditional Spectral Fighters because of this, rather than the bosses and the levels that we find later on with NieR. It's also kind of interesting because it's one of the only instances in which the game has full control of the story flow, and the structure of the writing is quite different because of that. And with the ending that the first section of the game has, it makes me think that it was actually deliberate, that this first section of the game was so different from the rest, and most importantly, I think it's really amazing how it manages to get you attached to characters in a single level, down to the point where their deaths so early on are impactful. So our first order of business is to analyze what NieR does right in its first level, to say the relationship from 2B to 9S, and how it immerses the player to the point of managing an emotional connection within 30 minutes. First off, it does a fantastic job of introducing you to the characters' personalities and dynamics with each other, in like one or two lines really. 2B is cold and unemotional, and 9S who feels thrilled to be working alongside her. And I think the scene that demonstrates this best is the one where 2B tells 9S that he can drop the san at the end of her name, or ma'am for the English version.
それと、さんはつけなくていい。え？私の名前に継承は必要ない。わかりました。2B.
2B says it because it's unpractical and unnecessary to be formal, but 9S feels as if 2B's opened up to him and feels intense joy. This scene also sets up this later scene.
ところで 2B。
何？
僕のことをよく知る親しい人は僕のことをナインズって呼ぶんですけど。
そう。
そろそろ 2B もどうですか？
何が？
だからナインズって呼んでくれていいんですよ。
まだいい。
From this point onward, the game sets off a couple of storytelling rules and lore, and then the real NieR Automata begins. The format of the game switches from a traditional single-level format to an open-world format, and while for the most part I am fine with the open-world format, the levels in between, and I think it does a really good job of keeping the game fresh and keeping the game long. I think the format for the first, second, and third playthrough, so all of them I guess, suffer from it. The content of the writing in of itself is fantastic in every way, and we'll get into that, but it's the storytelling and the structure for the storytelling found in all playthroughs that really bother me. Because of the way that the open world system of the game is structured, the story progression on the first and second playthrough relies on walking to a place, being told where to go, and from there, a story develops. There's no story setup for most things other than go here and do that, and this extends to the way that quests are structured, both main and side, where they just tell you to go from A to B and sometimes back to A or to C in order to accomplish an objective. This makes it so the game, especially the first and third playthrough, suffered from something that I call amusement park writing, and I think I've mentioned it in the past, in which you start at some place and then the adventures grows from one destination to the next, not because the story flows there naturally for the characters to end up there, but rather because the characters go from one place to another and accomplish what at first glance seem like unrelated objectives, and so the story ends up being formatted as a sort of bubble of predetermined places. One place being the neutral point of the story, and then a bunch of separate bubbles being the destinations, or in this analogy, the rides. All sorts of media suffer from this really. Examples are the movie Interstellar is a lot like this, where you have a neutral point in the ship, and then they go to a bunch of different planets separately, not because from one planet they end up in the next, but because they get to the neutral point, and then they're like, alright, there's 3 planets, let's go to the first, back to the neutral point, let's go to the second, back to the neutral point, let's go to the third, back to the neutral point, and from there, the story kinda closes up. Honestly, I am no big fan of this structure because the setup ends up being really awkward and really forced for the most part, but this game needs the structure, and I'll get into that later on. However, even though it is a somewhat unfortunate storytelling structure, it does not mean that the contents found within each bubble is not incredible. It does hurt the setup a little bit, yes, but it's incredible. The structure that side quests take, however, is a little bit different, and one of the main boons this game has when it comes to side quests is its incredible ability to establish a character, play around with them, and then finalize their character arc. Like they did with 2B and 9S in the intro level. It's done a lot with a lot of side characters and extra missions, where you don't even need more than a couple of lines to develop a character and play around with them. One of the main examples of this is the machine lost in the desert. The machine is lost in the desert because it cares very deeply about her sister. This is for the most part a setup. And then you go pick her up, and on the escort back, her character is developed completely to a character of childlike curiosity and care. And the dialogue is incredible, of course, not only because of the incredible dynamic between 2B and 9S, but because it also established a modifier and a setup very, very quickly on a very, very minor character, on a cutscene or on a part of the game that doesn't really last all that long, and it's really incredible how it manages to do that.
それは、いや、機械生命体もアンドロイドも子供は作ることはできなくて。2B。
そんな声で言われても、私は助けられない。
NieR Automata is a masterpiece in a very different way from most games. When I look at other games that I hold on high pedestals like Bloodborne or Cave Story, and I compare them to why I like those games, to why I like NieR Automata, it's really interesting. So for example, games like Bloodborne and Cave Story, and even Catherine to a degree, those are games where the game by itself can have a really strong gameplay loop, or a really just strong gameplay experience, and it's really fun to play it, but it's that gameplay experience is also complemented by the music and the visuals of the game as well as a possible story. The music and the visuals of the game are also individually really, really good and really, really enjoyable, but they're also complemented by the gameplay that it's fun to discover them and play them and listen to them while you're playing the game. So it all really complements each other, but individually, by themselves, they are strong. But NieR is a special case in that its individual components aren't really the best, but it's how they work together with one another and how it all complements and goes together with each other that makes NieR a truly fantastic experience in game. And this became especially apparent to me, like I mentioned, when I was first drafting this video. It was simply impossible to talk about gameplay and storytelling separately. If we look into each aspect of NieR Automata, we might conclude that it's a mediocre or not a very special game. The gameplay loop for NieR Automata is to traverse a level in order to get to a location and accomplish an objective in an RPG fashion, which often requires you to overcome an obstacle, which is, in most cases, enemies. This is a very simple, repetitive, and exhaustive gameplay loop, really, when you think about it. Its core is that of a third-person spectacle fighter with light and heavy attacks and dodging involved, with small features like the pods and no real gameplay changing mechanics. Normally games like these have a mechanic or two that changes the gameplay in a way that it doesn't make it feel super repetitive. These mechanics modify the core gameplay experience from similar ones. As I mentioned earlier Bloodborne. Bloodborne and a game like NieR, a spectacle fighter, they are more similar than they seem really because they have light and heavy attacks, and down to their core, they're kind of similar. But it's the mechanics and the way that the game works that changes these gameplay experiences and keeps them fresh and interesting. Enemy design, on the other hand, is also nothing to write home about, since most enemies are pretty simple and they require no real separate strategy to fight. And that is mostly because of the overly simplistic combat core. When you look at the combat core of NieR, as we talked about, it is extremely simple and it doesn't have any extra mechanics that it needs you to know in order to get to know the combat better and in order to make the combat more complex. And as such, fighting enemies is really repetitive, and it's for the most part the same, and it doesn't require you to learn an enemy. As I mentioned, if we were to look at all of these separately, we might come to the conclusion that NieR is just not a very special game or not a very special experience. It's, however, how the game links all of this together that solves it. The main obstacle with such a simplified core is that it's very difficult to differentiate encounters, since the way you fight all enemies is relatively the same. When you're just using the same combinations of buttons for a level 5 enemy of a small size than in a fight against a creature about 4 times your size, important encounters and boss fights tend to feel overall the same or less impactful. But this is in theory. The way the game's written, in which story and gameplay are interlaced perfectly, helps add a lot of impact to boss fights and meaningful fights, with the game's masterful use of tone setting and context, along with the beautiful soundtrack that goes along with it. The gameplay is the same, yes, but the feeling it portrays is very different. Fighting a number of small enemies in the wild randomly with really calm music in the background, you're just walking around and you just randomly fight one.
Yeah.
The gameplay is the same as the next scene I'm gonna show, which is fighting waves of enemies, the same type of enemy or maybe slightly different enemies. It's the same buttons, it's the same gameplay. But it's the context, it's the music, it's the perspective, it's the scene structure that really changes the feeling. So for example, for a contrast of why this is so important, let's compare NieR to a game with a very similar core, Bayonetta 2. A game with tons of different combat experiences, actual mechanics to go along with it unlike NieR, and tons of weapons and combos that keep the combat fresh and filled with choice and variety. However, even though Bayonetta offers more choice and more tools to alter the combat experience, NieR ends up doing a better job of keeping each encounter separate from each other. And this is mostly because Bayonetta 2's stories isn't really impactful, and it doesn't develop its characters as single instances, like we mentioned on the side quests, how NieR can develop a character on a single instance, or on just a couple of lines, just a bit of a setup and then expands it. Bayonetta 2 never really does this. Bayonetta 2 pretty much establishes a character, and that character has pretty much no development or doesn't expand at all. It just keeps being that character. Another reason is because Bayonetta 2 never seriously switches tones. The tone and the characters always feel sort of goofy and sort of godlike and impossible, and that is because of the way that they are written. And boss fights can feel huge, sure. You can be a woman fighting like a huge thing, but it doesn't really feel super impactful because of the context and because of the tone of the game. Killing a god in a game of killing gods, when they have no character development or context or like individual emotional weight to the fight, it just feels like another day in their life in that same way. Fighting through bosses or playing through Bayonetta 2 feels like much of the same after each level without changing tones or emotions attached. Just for a quick comparison of how another game series does this differently is the the one that we talk about a lot, which is the Soul series, in which they use both context and gameplay, in which all bosses have a very, very special and set tone that they use throughout the level, and they build up throughout the level, and then it sort of culminates on the boss. And on that same way, unlike Bayonetta or unlike NieR, you do have to learn every single enemy's attacks in order to actually be able to defeat it. NieR, on the other hand, differentiates combat by making boss fights really, really personal. Every single damn boss fight in Automata has an emotional storytelling weight to it, even the ones that you have basically no relation to. For example, the first Atom fight, which introduces the dilemma of the game, the fear of evolution, the original tone setting with the machines, which I will talk about next, and the amazing soundtrack layered on top of it. The fight after it, with the songstress, which introduces a very clear theme to the boss fight early on, especially with the added context that second playthrough provides, and its added screams. Also, of course, the tone setting context that the mission gives you. The second Atom fight, where he gives you a speech and you can see the evolution of his character and his obsession to mankind, his sadism and willingness to go far to become human, as well as the added pressure of a character that you already have a relationship, which is 9S. The fight with Eve, where he's just constantly yelling out for his brother, and how you can see like everything slowly going to shit. And even fights that in theory should have no emotional storytelling weight to it, like the Koshi and Roshi fight, whose brilliant momentum we'll tackle later on in this video, and of course the final fight, with the weight of the entire game behind it. While the gameplay of NieR is repetitive, it doesn't feel that way because of the way it manages tone, storytelling tools, and context. And this leads me to the next point of conversation, in which I shall explain why I can't stress enough how good NieR is at rule setting and tone setting. As I now have hopefully been able to establish, it's very clear that all of NieR Automata relies very, very heavily on the masterful use of tone setting, character setting, and story development, and the context or music for each scene. The way the game uses tone is masterful. It all fits, from the super emotional heavy scenes to the actually super absurd stuff, and I feel like the best example of this would be about 3 hours in the desert. The first time you're told to visit the desert, you're met with the objective of killing machines in select areas, and then the game smoothly eases you in to the next rule of the story that will become a core element of it from this point onward. First with machines popping up and saying a simple single word. This simple single word has an impact on the characters, and the game emphasizes that.
機械生命体が言葉を
The machines are talking to be surprised, showing the player that this is an unusual event. This also starts sparking up a sense of curiosity on the player, and periodically builds up the bigger impact that the machines are sentient in a way. The game makes sure to show a very, very clear and very deliberate progression. The game changes the original dynamic that we saw in our past experience with the game. The machines can talk, the machines can think, the machines can feel. It establishes this rule and leaves the player to come up with their own analysis, making it super smooth and not ham-fisted at all. This also helps my earlier point of the first level being separated in purpose as if it was a different game. The machines they introduced to you then, as mindless pieces of junk, to the machines in the real game, sentient beings. And now it takes this newly established rule, a rule that leaves the beholder to figure out, a rule that is crucial to the rest of the game, that of machines attempting to be human, and it takes it to this absurd extreme seamlessly, with the machines going from imitating human emotion and human families to imitating human sex, and even one of them being heard in the background saying, "I like boobs." If this sort of comedic line was pulled off at the very beginning or very soon after it, then it wouldn't have worked as flawlessly and as naturally as it did in practice, because the game had intense amounts of deductive setup and build-up, and even before showing it, it had 1 or 2 lines of deeper setup. And then it goes sort of from this comedic sense, and it goes right back to the intense air that it's been building up to. The machines are aware of their situation and want it to stop. Again, completely seamless, and this incredibly clear contrast of how well this game manages theme and tone. It sets a tone of wonder and curiosity, and then takes advantage of what is established from the last tone it used, and evolves into something that feels completely logical, taking into consideration what we've learned so far from the past scene or the past tone, and it takes it to a ridiculous and funny extreme, and then it catches you off guard. This scene is so well done, and this rule is set in place by such a strong base, that this scene, along with the reinforcement of the amusement park, which only establishes this rule further, is carried throughout the entire game. They don't have feelings, repeats NieR, showing how the characters constantly reminds the players the information that they already have when introducing or bending the previously established rules in order to get new ones. And this is how NieR, across the 35 hours it took me to complete, managed to keep me, and many other people that played it, completely on my toes. It sets up an environment, a tone, a rule, and then it slowly, throughout a scene, changes it. They're just imitating human behavior. All of that built-up tension and information is brought to a satisfying conclusion. It introduces the rules that machines are sentient, and it doesn't ever stop taking this further and further from both a storytelling, a philosophical, and a comedic standpoint. The entirety of NieR Automata is based on this rule it sets at the very beginning of the game. A rule it sets, and it doesn't ever stop evolving and developing the machines as a second set of characters that develop apart from the main cast. For example, when a machine has an obsession with being beautiful, machines repeating stuff over and over and failing, and Adam being obsessed with death. And this is completely without mentioning how the scene abuses all of the pressure from this intense amount of information and then uses it in a boss. NieR Automata couldn't be farther from one-dimensional. On one side, the core of the story is what we just talked about the evolution of the machines as characters or as a group, but at the same time it has a main cast that does take part in this evolution, but at the same time isn't really on the same page. It develops away from it. Comparing the desert level to the intro level also shows us the type of rule setting that you need to do for both dimensions. The intro level did all of the rule setting and character establishing, and also introduced the dynamic between characters 9S and 2B, by having them engage in conversations where the extremes and contrasts of their personalities were shown. And as for rule setting, in order to speak of a universe, you need to set the rules slowly and then play around with them until they feel a lot more natural. If we look at some of the more intense and emotionally overloaded parts of the game, they are, more often than not, the sections of the game in which the universe evolving around the characters and the characters themselves sort of melts together. And this brings us to the creation to the perfect character for this job, Adam. In my opinion, there's about 3 main points of fusion in NieR Automata for both of these dimensions. The introduction of the core in the desert that we just talked about, the second fight with Adam, which is in my opinion the most intense fight in the game, and the ending for the third playthrough. All really heavy moments. The second fight with Adam is everything we've been talking about materialized. It takes the theme of evolution, the search for human thinking, and the obsession that comes with it, down to the point where he'll play with 2Bs and the player's emotions, attaching a personal relationship from the first dimension to the situation in order to obtain depth to the emotional result. This is where you can see that both of these layers sort of mix in order to obtain something really, really personal and really, really heavy. It takes a dimension that you're not developing in. It takes a dimension of the machines, one that you are not directly related to, sort of just related to in passing. It almost seems like a modifier for the main character's development. And then it takes this layer that doesn't seem like you're living in it, and it takes something from your world and sort of pushes it in, and as such it makes the second layer that you're not involved with really, really personal. Adam is consistently throughout the first and second playthrough the perfect bridge between these two dimensions. He interacts with the characters on the first as an individual, but also develops on the second. And honestly, after thinking about it further, I don't think that this sort of double-dimensional storytelling can be pulled off in any other medium. And if it can, it's very, very hard to. The reason too is because movies, TV shows, books, those are normally written in a first dimension, the dimension of the characters. And if you try to play with 2 dimensions where you're trying to develop the main cast that you're developing on the first layer, and you're trying to develop the universe at the same time, more often than not, you're not going to have time to develop both at the same time for each other. So what ends up actually happening is that you're developing characters on the first layer, and then sort of randomly something new happens, and since it didn't do any rule setting, like the desert that we just showed, how it eases you into a new rule, it can just sort of feel sort of jarring, and like this new rule sort of came out of nowhere, since you were spending all of your time setting up the characters and the development of the characters on the first layer, but the second layer doesn't have a constant evolution. It just sort of randomly introduces rules with no sort of real setting. To introduce a second evolving dimension to this piece of media means introducing characters, and in turn this also means that instead of two different kinds of dimensions, we have two dimensions of the same kind, where instead of it being the world materialized on a character like Adam is, you may have two different sets of characters that are developing apart from each other, and they sort of have like a circle around them, making them two character dimensions instead of one character dimension and one world dimension. The best example that I could come up of this is the book Out by Natsuo Kirino. It's a book that sets two sets of characters, a set of characters entering a life of crime, and a second set of characters that does not interact with the first for the most part of the book, but represents the world around them. People that have been living the life of crime for a really long time. However, it sort of fails to set up a double-dimensional storytelling, since all of the setup for the world-based dimensions was just a setup for it to become part of the character dimension, so it fuses. But it's not like NieR Automata, where it's two parallel lines that sometimes crash. It's more like a cone, drifting towards the end. Now let's talk about the main problem NieR faces with the storytelling, how it fixed it, and how also the second playthrough forwards both of those dimensions before moving on to the third and final one. We've talked about NieR's masterful use of tone setting, rule setting, and brilliant dialogue in order to introduce characters in a really short amount of time. What we have not talked about, however, is how NieR Automata suffers from being relatively short on a single playthrough basis. This becomes increasingly apparent on the second playthrough, but if you pay close attention, you can see it on the first two. It's hard to forget that NieR is a relatively short story for its first playthrough, since it's designed for you to waste a lot of time with its open world in order to make sure the game feels way longer, which is why it needs that amusement park structure that we talked about earlier. It is often a structure that doesn't feel very smooth, but is also a structure that can be paused at any point in the story for you to be able to go explore somewhere, do some more side quests, get the Macariel ending, and then go back to the main quest with no problems. This structure and necessity to pace yourself in between story bits in order for it to feel natural makes the second playthrough feel really rushed and oddly paced, since you either have to start quests over or you aren't able to finish them. But that doesn't really matter much, because the second playthrough is not about how hooked it gets you unlike the first, especially since it's very hard to keep you on your toes with previously mentioned writing techniques, since you've already seen most of it. The second playthrough, while it's not very good and it's my least favorite part of the game by far, is necessary in order to smoothly transition to the third playthrough, and this is why. Stories take time to develop. A character or story arc needs to have some history with the viewer in order for the viewer to actually feel something when they're in a bad situation, or in this case, they die. The second playthrough exists because the first by itself is too short. Sure, maybe you've already been attached to the 2B and 9S characters, but in order for 2B's death to be effective on the third, you need some time in between. And since it's a game loop, it's not just extra time or extra content. It's a loop of the game that you've already played. It's an illusion, 5 extra hours that make you think that the story is set in stone and that it's all fine. It's 5 extra hours in which you get to expand and remind the player of these characters, and to get them even more attached so that when 2B does die, there's an emotional build-up to that stressful point. In a perfect world, however, the second playthrough could be completely stripped. All the new content it offers has no reason to be on a whole new playthrough other than the novelty of playing as 9S, and even this novelty wears off very quickly when he's most of the third playthrough too. All the scenes that are not present in the first playthrough that are in the second have no real story reason to be exclusively on the second. All the extra lore bits that we can see from the bosses or before entering a zone don't really have any special effect from being narrated by 9S. And even the one scene that truly matters, that 9S is in control in the first and second playthrough stories, is also completely optional, as instead of making the player play as 2B the whole time, you could just switch to 9S's perspective for a little bit, only for that scene before taking control of 2B again, especially since the scene that 2B is experiencing at that moment The one about becoming gods is in my opinion the weakest part of the game and the most irrelevant to the rest of the story. And that's how the second playthrough forwards both of the dimensions the game rides on and is necessary in order for the third to be effective. The first playthrough is written for the first dimension of the game, that of the characters developing and growing alongside each other, as long with their relationships. The second playthrough is just written for the machines and the developing of it. The first playthrough wants you to have the Eve fight by itself and without any information, so that the fight is seen in a single dimensional level and it's one character against the other. This fight is not about the conflict of the machines or anything that involves any other character really. This fight is completely about 2B versus Eve and the emotional build-up between those characters. Adam and Eve being born, Eve respecting and following his brother throughout his obsession with humanity, Adam getting killed by 2B, and Eve exploding in emotions and rushing in to kill 2B. But for the second playthrough, you aren't really focusing on any of that, since the second playthrough is written for the second dimension of the game, the one about world building and the machines, while in the first time, the game focuses on setting an emotional arc between 2B and Adam, and 2B and Eve. 9S is expanding on what we already know about the machines and the androids, and discovers a couple of really revealing things in order to set up a general vibe of mystery for the third playthrough, that of discovering a larger scheme within the universe. So all in all, I feel like the format for the first playthrough doesn't really work with the faster pacing of the second playthrough, but it was necessary that the second playthrough existed, and it was a clever little trick, to be honest. And so now we will talk about how the third playthrough takes all of the pressure built up from the first two, and how it exploits it in order to conclude the story. 2B's character becomes very interesting by the third playthrough. It's not usual for a character that is considered by many as the game protagonists, and also the character that is the head of most of the marketing of the game, to take the role that she does. By the end of the second playthrough, both of these characters are very well established, and the game leads you to believe that this inseparable combo are the heroes of our story. But then the story takes a complete 180 once again and kills off 2B, again showing what we talked about in the desert. It sets a rule that we think to be unbendable, and then not only bends it, but breaks it completely. The first and second playthrough are all about 2B and 9S establishing a relationship between them. However, there is a very small distinction between how the characters develop individually along with the relationship. 2B's character reaches its maximum conclusion at the end of endings A and B along with her death. She has completely evolved from a cold person who only cares about the mission to caring about 9S very deeply. However, with the revelation that 9S obtains near the end of playthrough 2, his character is set up for much more. 2B's character arc is over, but 9S's is just beginning. And so since 2B's character has been fully explored and developed, her role switches from that of a main character to a direct modifier to 9S's character, and as a storytelling tool in the form of 9S's suffering from this point onward. Since most of the interesting points of conversation in the third playthrough are highlighted in the tower, I feel like talking about the third playthrough individually and on a scene-by-scene basis, as we have done with the rest of the game, is kind of meaningless, since instead of talking about the third playthrough as a whole, I will talk about the tower level. The tower level is a perfect culmination of every theme, every tone, every development that this game has. It's a perfect ending to a perfect game. You first enter the tower as 9S. It's at first highlighted how 9S has lost all of the interest on everything but destroying the machines, not learning more about them or ending the war. This is personal. It is also a very powerful line where we see the extreme ups and downs that 9S has been taken through. A model with extreme curiosity forms a deep relationship with 2B. All of the data that 9S has gathered up to this point before meeting 2B is that of machines being simply the monsters that they fight. But his journeys with 2B challenge this data. He starts to accept it and even treats Pascal as an equal. When he goes to find out about A2, he finds the truth of Yorha and then 2B dies. His character slowly is driven into madness. All he knew has been challenged multiple times. His life has no purpose. He is no different to that which he hates, and his one personal reason to live is gone. Ninus' character development gets pretty intense and brought to a satisfying conclusion on the tower level. I would say, while the three main characters are developed in a pretty good way, NieR is the only one whose character is taken to an extreme, and he's also an extremely important character to show a contrast between irrational hate and the weight of the relationship between him and 2B. This level does a perfect job of encapsulating every single aspect of NieR's character and bringing it to a conclusion. As we've talked about, this game is running on a two-dimension setup. One dimension being the individual characters, their relationships and developments to each other, and their relationships and lives within the second dimension, which is that of the machines attempting to be human. In this hour, it is demonstrated that both of these dimensions are used to prove two different themes and points in order to wrap the game up. The machines attempt to get closer and closer to humanity without actually being humans, and their algorithms make them imitate human behavior to such an advanced degree that the network destroys itself over a simple argument. This theme also extends to the pods, where being programmed to do objective things are taken away by their subjective feelings and emotions. The androids the humans left behind acted as if they wanted to be human. The machines the aliens left behind acted as if they wanted to be human. The pods the androids created acted as if they wanted to be human. The dimension focused on the characters, however, is brought to a very personal conclusion with the theme that it was all for naught. You suffer without purpose, you live without purpose, and you fight without purpose. None of your actions have any meaning behind it, and we just all keep living because that's what we do. Not because there's a bigger picture of humans on the moon, not because there's a grand plan laid out for us. None of it had any reason to be, it just was. It's really interesting how this game managed to have two dimensions constantly running alongside each other, and also working in perfect absolute symphony in order to reach a conclusion like this. Now that's a show of skill in writing if I've ever seen one. It takes everything to an extreme, from its characters to its themes to its multiple dimensions, and even adding random thoughts in between. NieR is an absolute masterpiece in writing, not only for video games, but for all media. And before the game wraps up, there's a couple of very interesting moments and a very interesting fight. The fight between Koshi and Roshi really comes out of nowhere, and has no individual build-up for both of these new characters that don't get so much as a name and a couple of lines. However, unlike the rest of the fights, this fight is masterfully placed based on sheer momentum and built-up stress of the level. The tower level is an overload of emotions and information. A lot of stuff is summed up and wrapped up very quickly. No loose ends. And as a result, it ends up being a level that manages to build up a lot of emotion and a lot of stress throughout it. The fight between Koshi and Roshi is wonderfully placed because it doesn't have any story implications, but it abuses the stress that the player has been building up to and keeps you on your toes. What even is supposed to happen next, you wonder, as you anxiously attempt to defeat the enemy in front of you. The constant switch between A2 and NieR makes it even better. Whatever is going to happen involves these two meeting up at the top, and it definitely does not look good.
この塔は月面の人類サーバーを狙った巨大砲台だ。このままだと人類の残存データが破壊されるだろう。
どうでもいい。もうどうでもいいんだよ、そんなこと。知ってた？僕らはこの世界に必要ないんだ。人類はもう滅んでる。アンドロイドが戦う意味を持つために作られた月面の偽装サーバー。その嘘を守るために用意されたヨルハ部隊は証拠隠滅のために最初から全滅するように計画されていた。バンカーに仕掛けられたバックドアは一定時間で起動。司令官も僕も 2B も全部捨て駒だったんだよ。おかしいよね。笑えるよね。
9S、私たち。
君は 2B を殺したじゃないか。それだけで十分だよ。僕たちが殺し合う理由なんて。
All of this pent-up emotion and stress culminates in this conversation, and on a very unfair decision between choosing which of these characters gets to live. No matter the outcome, it's ridiculously depressing, and there's a lot of info from the scene that we'll deliberately look over, like the revelation that 2B is in fact 2E, a model built with the sole purpose of killing 9S when he knew too much. I feel like this revelation is supposed to make the game more depressing in theory, but I feel like a lot of the themes of the game don't really align in order to make this a really powerful revelation. We're told that 2B kills 9S over and over, but we don't really get to see it, so I feel like down to a personal level, it doesn't really matter. And the true thing to take away is the otherwise flawless and depressing ending such a wonderful story needed.
ポット1号さんよりプレイヤーへ質問が存在する。君はニーやオートマタをクリアできずに苦しんでいる者たちに対して何か言葉はあるか?
But there is something else, isn't there? Games now and again do this cute thing where they acknowledge the player and thank them, but NieR, as it should be abundantly clear to you by this point, is on a completely different level. Ending E is supposed to represent a more hopeful ending, where every character is given a second chance thanks to the pods gaining conscience and rebuilding them. But I feel like this whole section of the game is not about the characters anymore. It is now completely written around your experience with the game, and it's sort of an enormous fight to give a closing air of it really is all over. It isn't closing the story of 2B, A2, 9S, or the machines. It's closing your story with the game and the relationships you've built with it. It feels really personal and detached from all fantasy. It's truly a masterful ending to what I believe to be the best example of writing in games, and what I think video games as a storytelling medium can accomplish, and I cannot wait to see what kinds of games this will spark off in 2 to 5 years. To be clear, I don't think NieR Automata is the single best story ever told in a video game, but I do believe it's the best example of the advantages games have when telling a story, and I believe I've never consumed any piece of media that has writing this masterfully crafted. And that would be it for the main game design analysis for NieR Automata. What a wonderful game. After 45 minutes or so of positive commentary, it feels kinda weird to add this to this video, but I do have a couple of nitpicks when it comes to the game systems and some of the character developments that are gonna be in another video separately in the future, so look out for that. I'd really appreciate it if you stuck around and subscribed. From this point onward, I'll post about a video a month. Is that a fucking dog? I'll post a video about once a month or so from this point onward, and I'd really appreciate it if you showed this video to anyone who you think would like it. This video took a shit ton of effort, unlike most of my videos. I think if you take like half of my catalog up to this point, which is like 20 or 25 videos or something, it took as much effort to make those 25 videos than it took to make this one video. So I would really appreciate it. Other than that, I have a Twitter where I complain about writing and game design in Japanese, and an Instagram where I post drawings and dumb stuff, and also a SoundCloud where I'll be releasing a second album in about a month or two. Thanks a lot for watching this video, and I do hope to see you around. Bye bye. Now I think on that sugar, such a kimmo yes, a dying eyes ama more and I kiss a carasiara, ama you go.